Okay, perfect. It should be recording. Okay, hello everyone and welcome to my presentation. Hello and good afternoon everyone, sorry. To start off, I would like to thank you all for being here today with me. My name is Yanet Salmeron. I am a fourth year biology major with a Spanish minor, and my amazing mentor was Doctora Amalia Cabezas from the Department of Media and Cultural Studies. However, she could not make it today due to an unprecedented event. However, I will do the best I can in my presentation in order to properly represent her like if she was here today. And the topic of my research is titled The Effects of the COVID-19 Pandemic on the Retention Rates for Latino University Students. And I will continue. Okay, so this slide shows the same information as previously discussed or mentioned. Sorry, my screen is acting a little bit weird in terms of the Zoom. Sorry. Okay, so first I will do a content overview. So my presentation will contain 6 different sections. At the beginning, I will do an introduction and a background that will explain some background information to understand the information that I will be presenting, as well as defining retention rates and a timeline of remote learning at UCR. And for the second section, I would do a literature review on the existing research and the purpose overall of my project. Third, I would discuss the findings and the data that I obtained, the methods that I used to obtain them, and the available data on retention rates. For my fourth section, I would discuss the impact of the pandemic on UCR and Latino university students as a whole, as well as some suggested policy changes and investment that can be used to alleviate the hardships that were faced by Latinos. Finally, the conclusion acknowledgement, which I will discuss like what will come next after my project, and the acknowledgement of people that were part of my project, and I really want to thank for it. And finally, some anticipated questions and Q&A. So some background information to keep in mind in terms of Latinos in education is that there has been pre-existing adversity for Latinos in education overall. This ranges from elementary school all the way to higher education. We can see this through the court case of Mendez versus Westminster, in which Latino families fought for their children's right to a fair education and against school segregation based on ethnic origin. And the other thing to keep in mind is that educational opportunities in California do not reflect the growing Latino population that is exponentially growing here. In addition, there are some existing disparities that exist in higher education, and this can be reflected in the difficulties in admission and getting into certain higher education institutions. And in addition to the lack of representation in staff and faculty and students and how they feel about that. In addition, economic difficulties make it harder for Latino students in order to make it difficult for students to continue in higher education. And then we will discuss about the COVID-19 pandemic that in March of 2020 caused a lot of schools around the nation to go into a remote setting immediately, which caused a lot of students and staff alike to be unsure of how to use remote learning and how to adapt to it, and what are the economic, social, and educational implications of the pandemic in itself, and how that reflected on the retention rates and the educational journeys of Latinos. And retention rates are defined as the percentage of a school's first year undergraduate students who continue at that school for the next coming year. And that's important to keep in mind for when I discuss the retention rates of the Latino students at UCR in general. So overall, let me explain like a timeline of the remote learning at UCR. So the timeline sort of indicates the uncertainty of remote and in-person learning, because in March of 2020, during week 10 at UCR winter 2020 quarter, the school was informed its students that it would transition to a remote learning, and that occurred during week 10. And so the finals occurred remotely the week after, and this continued until summer 2021, in which that was the last quarter of remote learning. And in fall 2021 and September 2021, students returned to in-person classes while some classes remained virtually. However, again, in winter break during December 2021, there was a rising cases of COVID with the Omicron variant, which caused UCR to move education remotely again, until which they originally planned to just be 2 weeks, but they extended it until the end of January, in which students returned back to class in January 31st of 2021. And it just kind of shows like of the uncertainty of like not knowing what was going to happen because of the pandemic. And now we would discuss the literature review of the existing studies that exist in this field relating to COVID-19. So some studies have analyzed the impact of the pandemic and remote learning on students overall, and they have seen that there was a higher amount of mental health issues such as stress, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts, in addition to reduced engagement and resource availability due to the online setting of format and the access to resources. In addition, some studies have analyzed the disproportionate impacts of the pandemic on university students depending on different demographics. One that they have considered is gender, and they did a study in which they found that females suffered more negative effects of isolation and other mental health issues, as well as negative effects in terms of their academics. And there was also a difference in how they cope with it compared to their male counterparts. And another study has analyzed the effects of the pandemic in terms of minority students, and found that minority students suffered higher levels of food insecurity and stress. And then some other existing research to keep in mind is that UCR is a Hispanic serving institution, which means that the majority of students attending UCR are identified as Latino, Latinx, or Hispanic, and that this means that they have additional funding from the government to allocate to education opportunities for Latino students. And 5 out of the 9 schools in the UC system are considered HSI. So overall, my motivation to create this project was to contribute to the existing knowledge of the studies that have been conducted in terms of the pandemic, and sort of try to input my opinion, as in like not just my opinion, but a sort of like the minority student experience, because a lot of times they are not taken into consideration in terms of experience or just kind of like institutions overall. So I wanted to kind of provide an insight into the Latino experience and overall provide a positive impact to my Latino community. And the overall purpose of my project was to identify the economic, social, and educational challenges that were faced by Latino students during the pandemic, as well as examining the effect of the pandemic on students at UCR and the Latino retention rates, in addition to potentially suggesting some policy changes and investments that can be implemented to reduce the overall impact of these adversities. So the way that I got the data for this project was through recently published sources like recent studies, and I conducted informal interview with a group of anonymous individuals at UCR to sort of gauge how the pandemic affected students there at UCR, Latinx, Latino students at UCR. And then I got the data for retention rates and continuing student rates from the UC Office of the President, University of California, and UCR Institutional Research. So something that we found, or the overall, is that Latinos are a very diverse category, so each person's experience may differ from one another. However, we found 3 common adversities that were faced by Latino students. The first and most common obstacles that were faced by Latino and exacerbated by the pandemic was economic-wise, in terms that a lot of students lost their jobs on campus as well as work study. This resulted in increased financial burden and it came in different forms, like in the loss of campus housing. In addition, a lot of students and their families were also frontline workers, so that meant that they were a higher risk of being exposed to COVID-19. And it was also one of the first industries that suffered the higher job loss than other industries during the pandemic. in addition to increasing financial family needs. So this kind of resulted in a struggle to create balance between school and work, in addition to finding a job if you didn't have some before, in addition to increased work hours. The second category that was type of adversity that was faced by Latino students was social-wise, and this came in different forms, such as healthcare, mental health, and housing disparity. And in terms of housing disparity, many of Latino students faced a high exposure risk household, in which that means that at least one person from the household was deemed an essential worker, so higher risk at contracting COVID-19. In addition, this meant that there was more inhabitants and less room ratio, so that meant that students had to kind of like live together, and they were at higher risk at contracting COVID-19. In addition, many Latinos suffer from pre-existing health conditions such as diabetes and high blood pressure, which increase their chances of getting COVID complications. In addition to there was difficulty in access to healthcare in terms of immigration status. And another issue that was commonly found in Latino students at UCR and in general or across the nation was mental health wise, that a lot of students suffered stress and anxiety due to the pandemic and the complications that came with it. But mental health is considered a taboo sort of in Latin culture. So it's kind of difficult to address this issue when it's not even acknowledged. And finally, in terms of educational wise, Latinos suffered from different like adversities that came with being first generation students and sort of navigating this new remote setting, as well as the little representation in faculty and staff. So this kind of manifested itself in the way that faculty dealt with unprecedented issues during the pandemic that arose during classes. And now we will see the data. We are seeing the data of the continuing students in the UC system as a whole. And it is important to note that Latinos made up 23 of the total continuing students as of 2016 and remained constant with a slight incline up to 24% in 2017 until 2019, where we saw a 1% increase, which stayed around 25% all throughout up until like 2020, 21, which is the available data. Now we will compare this to the continuing student data at UCR, which is much different, in which the number of continuing Latino students at UCR differs from those in the UC system, with an increase with a 35% increase in 35% of students in 2016, 39% in 2017, and this remained constant until 2019. It remained constant until 2019, which increased in up to 41%, and we saw a decline in continuing students from 41% in 2019 to 39%, from 41% to 39% in 2020. And next, we will talk about the detention rates at UCR in itself in terms of Latino students. As we can see, based on the retention rates at UCR provided by the UCR institutional research, we observed a 5% decline of Latino students between 2019 and 2020 school year for year one students, while the year two students retention rates have not been made available. We predict that there will also be a decline in terms of the retention rate. And this decline has not been observed since 2015 and 2016, but it was a smaller decline compared to the years 2019 and 2020, which were the years affected by the pandemic. And finally, every year, the schools in the UC system share the University of California Undergraduate Experience Survey, which collects data on student experience from academic to personal input. The figure shows the top reasons for Latino students who plan not enroll at UCR for the fall of 2020. And most students plan to graduate early, but from those that did not, the majority, they listed 3 reasons for not enrolling in UCR in 2020. The first one came at financial challenges, the second one was family responsibilities, and the third one was health concerns, which were all kind of like related to the ways that that was found with Latino students across the U.S. that they suffered from. The students at UCR also faced these different adversities and were worsened by the pandemic. So overall, the impact of the pandemic on Latino students at UCR, they face similar challenges both in nationwide and at UCR individually. Many and the first adversity that was found through the interviews was economic challenges, unemployment, housing, healthcare, as well as we saw that when intersectionality in terms of being undocumented or identified as a certain gender sort of complicated these issues. The second most common issue that was found was mental health wise. Many students suffered from anxiety, stress, and health concerns. And in addition, many students who identified under the LGBTQ returned back to hostile environments. So this really affected their mental health wise because they no longer had that safe community at UCR. And in addition, the third most faced adversity by Latino students at UCR was in terms of the remote learning. And this came in different forms, like trying to find different study space, engagement with staff and other peers, in addition to technological resources. However, since UCR is an HSI school, it has a higher percentage of Latino students, which allowed it to address its this group of students with their needs and making programs and assistance programs that help provide relief for them. For example, they created the Loan to Learn program that was available for faculty and UCR students that helped provide resources such as hotspots and laptops in case they needed it for remote learning, as well as increased technological support online that was changed remotely, like kind of increased remotely. And in addition, they increased their hours for the art pantry. In addition, other programs such as the Academic Resource Center and the Career Center increased their number of hours and availability virtually in order to access students and better help them in an online format, as well as student programs such as Chicano student programs, undocumented student programs, Women's Resource Center, the LGBTQ Resource Center, etc. All of these cultural student programs on campus really helped students and provided the community they needed in order to get through the pandemic together, face these adversities, and give them moral support to continue on their educational journey. So some policy changes and investments that we recommend that will help the adversities that these students face sort of become less. In terms of federal and state-wise, we recommend that there is a continued investment of funding for higher education. It's not good when it's just like emergency-wise, because this has to be a continued investment, because these problems don't just exist because of the pandemic. Were actually worsened by the pandemic and highlighted because of the pandemic, but it's a continued problem that needs to be addressed, and to help these minority students to ensure that they remain and help them attain a higher education, such as the CARES Act that was passed. So this legislation was more on a constant investment instead of just emergency-wise. And in terms of institutional levels, such as UCR, it is crucial for them to take into account their student population and the student feedback that they get during times like these, because it helps improve the system to try and provide assistance that are targeted to those specific students and their needs. In addition, UCR and other institutions can help provide financial assistance in terms of scholarships and grants, which, even though this might not alleviate situations such as economic hardship, it will help lessen the burden of those problems on Latino students. And then overall, I decided to do this project to share a common experience, but as I am presenting this project, I want to say that I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone. However, I just wanted to show like a general overview of what Latinos experienced during the pandemic and what was found as being the three main issues: economic, social, and educational wise, that they faced during the pandemic, that were pre-existing to some degree, but they were exacerbated by the pandemic and sort of highlighted in a way that it wasn't before and cannot be ignored. And I want to make it to make it clear that everyone's experience is valid, and this diversity is what kind of makes this wonderful and sort of like a very diverse uh, category of information, because there's just so much diversity. And in terms of, I want to continue by publishing my research to get the word out there. And I want institutions to take sort of Latino experience in mind. And in addition, I hope researchers can continue the investigation of the ongoing pandemic. And these are the acknowledgements of who I would like to thank for their commitment and support through the project. And finally, here are some anticipated questions with some answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. We are out of time, but please take a glance at these. And if you have any questions or comments, you can type them in the chat and we'll make sure to share them. But great job. This is great research and definitely something of my interest as well. And